The wind in that part of Montana in the late 1870s did not just blow, it scoured. It came down from the high peaks of the Absaroka Range, carrying ice and the memory of high, empty places. It scraped the valleys clean and piled the snow in drifts that could swallow a horse. In one of these valleys sat the town of Gray Butte. It was a hard town living on hard money, silver scraped from the rock walls to the east, and cattle driven up from the south. Men came here to get rich or to disappear. Few did either comfortably. Jack Moran belonged to the mountains, not the town. He had been a mountain man when the term still meant something. He had guided surveyors and trapped beaver in creeks that had no names. He knew the Yellowstone Basin when it was just steam and sulfur and the sound of the crow moving through the pines. He had also known loss. He was a widower. His wife, Ellen, had not been taken by a bullet or a bear. She had been taken by a fever in a cramped mining camp, coughing her life out while the snow fell outside. He had buried her himself. He dug through 3 feet of frozen ground. When the last shovel of dirt hit the pine box, something in him froze solid with it. He stood over that small mound and he made a vow. He swore he would never again attach himself to a pretty woman. He would not give fate another chance to tear his heart out. Beauty, to him, was just a prelude to pain. It was a trap, and he was too smart an animal to step in the same one twice. He was not entirely alone. He had Ayanna. She was Apsaluk, the people the whites called the Crow. She was a warrior. Her spirit was straight as her arrows. They had history. Jack and she, they had saved each other's lives near the Great Geysers. Years back, he had pulled her from a freezing river. She had stitched him up after a grisly encounter. She knew the mountains as well as he did, perhaps better. She moved with a silent discipline and carried the high, clean honor of her tribe. She did not speak often, but when she did, Jack listened. Jack lived in a small cabin tucked against the timberline, hidden by spruce and rock. His life was stripped down to necessities. He spent his days chopping wood for the long winter, or checking the few traps he still ran. He spent his nights listening. The wind, the snap of a branch, the cry of a wolf. His hearth was cold. The big cast-iron stove in the center of his one-room cabin was usually dark. He would light it to brew coffee in the morning and fry bacon, then let it die. The ash in the pan was gray and settled, much like his own heart. He preferred the sharp honesty of the cold. Down in the valley, Gray Butte was not cold. It was simmering. The town lived under the heavy shadow of Baron Luther Kane. Kane was a man who smiled while he signed papers that ruined other men. He had come west with money and had used it to buy the richest silver claim. Then he bought the freight company. Now, nothing moved in or out of Gray Butte. Not a bag of flour or a stick of dynamite, without Kane taking his share. He was a cunning man, patient as a snake in the sun. He did not work alone. Every Sunday, Deacon Pierce stood in the pulpit of the town's only church and preached about damnation. He spoke of sin and moral decay, his eyes scanning the pews for the weak. He demanded a harsh, unforgiving virtue from the people. But many had seen the deacon leaving Kane's office late at night, his hat pulled low. It was a partnership of greed dressed in piety. Whispers moved through the saloon. Kane's hired guns, a rough bunch who called themselves the Copperhead Gang, were getting bold. They harassed prospectors. They raided supply wagons and blamed it on the natives. They had burned a small settlement of Apsaluk shelters down by the river. The judge in Gray Butte was a small man with watery eyes, and he kept his gavel quiet. Into this valley came Lenora Finch. She was called Nora. She was an orphan, raised by a hard aunt who taught her that survival was a matter of utility. Nora's utility was in the kitchen. She was a camp cook, hired by a small settler outfit pushing west. She was young, but she knew how to make tough beef tender and how to stretch rations for another week. The night before, that settler outfit had met trouble. Fire, shouting, the crack of gunfire. She had fled into the darkness with only what she could grab. She carried her spice chest, a heavy wooden box filled with small tins of cinnamon, salt, and precious dried herbs. She had her roll of kitchen knives, sharp and practical. and she had a leather-bound book, its pages filled with her mother's handwriting. Recipes, cures, a lifetime of wisdom on how to feed men and keep them alive. She had stumbled through the snow and darkness, fleeing the sound of the men who were chasing her. By sheer luck, she found Jack's cabin. The door was unlocked. She had slipped inside, collapsed on the floor, and slept the sleep of the exhausted, half-frozen dead. When she woke, the cabin was empty and bitterly cold. She saw the stove. She saw the wood pile. She was a cook. A cook's first duty is to light the hearth. Jack Moran returned at dusk. The cold clung to him like a second skin. He carried an axe on his shoulder and his rifle in his hand. He was tired. He was hungry. He was ready for his cold bacon and his cold bed. Then he stopped. He was 50 yards from his cabin, and he stopped dead. Smoke. It was coming from his chimney pipe, not the thin, hesitant smoke of his own morning fire, but a steady, gray plume. He moved silently, his boots making no sound on the packed snow. He eased the rifle into the crook of his arm. As he got closer, he smelled it. It was not just wood smoke, it was coffee, rich and dark. It was cornbread, the sweet, heavy smell of it baking. It was food, real food. His cabin was supposed to be empty. He reached the door. He listened. He heard the scrape of metal on metal. Someone was using his stove. His hand moved from his rifle and rested on the worn wooden grip of the Colt revolver at his hip. He eased the door open. The cabin was warm. For the first time in years, the room felt alive. The big iron stove was glowing with heat. A figure was bent over it. A woman. She was using his heavy skillet. Jack's hand tightened on the gun. He did not speak. He just watched. The figure straightened. Hearing the cold air from the open door, she turned. It was Nora. She was young. Her hair was tucked under a plain cap, but strands of brown had escaped. Her face was streaked with soot from the stove. She was wearing a man's coat, far too large for her, which she must have found on a peg, but her eyes were steady. They were clear and direct. She was not frightened. She looked just as tired as he felt. She was holding his wooden spoon. She spoke first. Her voice was low, but it carried in the warm room. "I cooked," she said. It was not an apology. It was a statement. "It is payment for the shelter." She gestured with her chin toward the window, which was now a black square of night. "There were wolves out there last night, and bad men." Jack stood there, frozen. His mind was a battleground. This was the thing he had sworn against. A woman, a pretty one. Underneath the grime and the fear, his vow, the memory of Ellen, the wall of ice he had built around himself, all of it told him to send her out, to throw her back into the cold. But the smell of the cornbread, the heat from the stove, the hunger in his belly, a deep, aching void that suddenly felt like more than just a need for food. He was caught. He did not know what to say. His hand was still on his gun. A shadow moved at the door. Ayanna stepped inside. She did not knock. She never did. She moved like the wind he had been fighting all day. Her dark eyes took in the scene in one sweep. She saw Jack, his hand on his weapon, his face tight with conflict. She saw Nora, standing by the stove, defiant and exhausted. She saw the skillet. Ayanna sniffed the air. A faint, almost imperceptible smile touched her lips. She looked at Jack, her gaze knowing. "I smelled the warm hearth," she said, her voice calm and practical. She unslung her own rifle and leaned it carefully against the wall. She looked past Jack and at Nora. Then she looked at the coffee pot. The three of them stood in the small, warm cabin. The mountain man, clinging to his old, cold grief. The young cook who had brought life back to his dead stove. And the warrior who understood the hunger and the hurt of them both. A new, uneasy alliance had just been formed. Ayanna walked past Jack and moved to the stove. She picked up a tin plate, the one Jack used, and held it out to Nora. It was not a request. It was a command. Nora, her hands shaking slightly, used the wooden spoon to scoop a heavy portion of cornbread onto the plate. She added a ladleful of thick bean and bacon stew from a pot simmering on the back of the stove. The smell was overpowering. It was the smell of life. Ayanna took the plate and nodded. She looked at Jack, who still had not moved from the doorway. "You are letting the cold in. Jack," she said. He shut the door. The sound was heavy. He took off his coat, his movement stiff, and hung it on its peg. He did not look at Nora. He looked at the stove, at the heat radiating from it, as if it were an enemy. He took his own plate and served himself, his motions rough. Nora served herself last, a smaller portion. They sat at the small, rough-hewn table for a long time. The only sounds were the scrape of spoons on tin and the steady roar of the wind outside. The coffee was black and scalding. Jack ate like a man starved, but his face was locked in a mask of anger. He was furious at the intrusion. He was furious at the coffee for tasting so good. He was furious at the bread for being warm. Every bite felt like a betrayal of the cold. Empty life he had chosen. Ayanna ate with purpose, her eyes missing nothing. She watched Nora. She saw the grime on her face, but she also saw the clean, unbitten fingernails. She saw the exhaustion in the girl's shoulders, but she also saw the way she held her spine straight. "You are a cook," Ayanna said. It was not a question. Nora looked up, startled. She nodded. "Yes, my mother taught me." "A camp cook." "Yes, I worked for a season with a buffalo hunting outfit south of the Yellowstone. Before that, for my aunt's boarding house." "You know how to cure meat for travel?" Ayanna asked. "Yes, salt box or smoke. Smoking is better if you have the time, but salt is faster. You know herbs." "Some for cooking," Nora said, gesturing to her spice box which sat by the door like a loyal dog. "And some for medicine. I can make a tonic from willow bark for fever, and a poultice of yarrow for a bleeding cut." "She is useful," Ayanna said to Jack. Jack did not answer. He pushed his empty plate away from him. The food sat heavy in his stomach. He looked at Nora, his eyes cold. "Tomorrow, I am taking you to Grey Butte. You can find your employer there." Nora's hands tightened in her lap. The fear that had been hiding behind her steady gaze now flooded her eyes. "He is there," she whispered. "Your employer," Jack stated. "The man who hunted me." Ayanna set her cup down. "Tell us." Nora began to speak, her voice low and hurried. She told them about the small wagon train she had joined in Sweetwater. They were settlers, good people, looking for land. She was hired to cook for the journey. They paid me $20 a month, in gold. She described the attack. It came just after dusk, 2 nights ago. "They were not trying to steal," she said, her voice shaking. "They were trying to kill. They rode in shooting. They set the wagons on fire." She stopped, swallowing. "I hid. I grabbed my box and my knives, and I ran into the brush. I saw the leader. He was on a big bay horse. He was shouting orders." "What did he look like?" Ayanna asked, her voice quiet. He wore a red scarf over his face, but it slipped. When he was yelling, it slipped down. I saw his face. He had a scar. It ran from his eye down to his jaw, like a hook. Jack looked at Ayanna. He knew that description. It was Scar, Luther Kane's right-hand man. "They saw me," Nora continued. "He saw me see him. He pointed. He shouted, 'Get the cook.' I ran all night. I fell in a creek. I lost a shoe. I kept moving. I thought I had lost them. But last night, I heard them again. They were close. That is when I found your cabin." Jack's jaw was tight. This was bad. This was town trouble. This was Kane's trouble. "Why you?" Jack asked, his voice rough. "Why hunt a cook?" "I do not know," Nora said. Then she paused. "But my hiring papers, they were from the freight company that organized the wagon train. She stood up, went to her spice box, and opened it. The smell of cinnamon and cloves filled the air from beneath a false bottom. She pulled a folded, damp piece of paper. She handed it to Jack. He unfolded it. It was a simple contract for services, but at the bottom, the stamp was clear, pressed into the paper in dark blue ink, Kane Freight and Mining. Jack swore, a low, bitter sound. He threw the paper on the table. Kane. Of course it is Kane. He looked at Nora, his anger returning. Either he hired you or he wanted to silence you. Either way, you have brought his fire right to my door. He stood up, pacing the small space between the table and the hearth. I want no part of this. Do you understand me? I am not in this fight. To hide from the storm is not the same as being safe from it, Ayanna said quietly from the table. Better to build a strong camp. My camp is fine, Jack snapped. It was fine until tonight. He turned back to Nora. The promise he had made over Ellen's grave was screaming in his head. No pretty woman, no pain. This girl was both. She was trouble. You will sleep in the loft, he said, pointing to the ladder in the corner. There are blankets up there. In the morning, I am taking you to the judge in Grey Butte. You can tell your story to him. It is not my business. Nora looked down at the paper. The fear in her eyes was hardening into something else. Despair, or resolve. The judge, she said flatly. Will he listen? He is the law. Jack said, Is he? She asked, her voice sharp. She reached into the pocket of her dress, the one she wore beneath the heavy man's coat. Her hand came out. She opened her fist and dropped something heavy on the table. It was a brass bullet casing. It rolled in a small circle before stopping next to Jack's tin cup. I found this at the camp, she said, where they shot the wagon master. Jack picked it up. He had seen casings like this before. They were special made, heavy caliber for a buffalo rifle. He turned it over in his calloused fingers. On the flat base, pressed into the metal, were 2 letters, L.K. Luther Kane. Jack stared at the letters. This was not a guess. This was proof. This was a death sentence. Ayanna leaned forward. The men hunting you are Kane's men, she said. This is not your trouble anymore. Nora, it is ours. Nora looked at Jack, her eyes pleading. Please, I am not asking for you to fight. I am asking for shelter. Just for a few weeks. I can cook. I can clean. I will mend your clothes. I am a hard worker. I will not be a burden. But if you take me to that town, he will find me. The man with the hook scar. He will find me, and he will kill me. Jack was trapped. The cabin was warm. The girl was terrified. And the proof was in his hand. He looked at the LK on the casing and felt the ice around his heart crack just a little. He hated it. He hated her for doing it. He was about to speak. He was about to say no. He was about to harden his heart and save himself. Thwack! The sound was sharp, a violent punctuation to the roar of the wind. All 3 of them froze. Embedded in the thick wood of the cabin door, quivering, was an arrow. It was not one of Jack's. It was not Absoluk. It was a crude, black-fletched arrow. Ayanna was on her feet before Jack had even processed the sound. She moved to the door, her knife in her hand. She did not open it. She stood beside it, listening. After a full minute, she pulled the arrow from the wood. It had been fired from a distance. With enough force to bury the tip 2 inches deep, it was a message. She unbarred the door and slipped outside, vanishing into the darkness. Jack stood by the table, the brass casing suddenly feeling hot in his hand. Nora was pale, her hand over her mouth. 2 minutes later, Ayanna was back. She brought the cold with her. She barred the door. Tracks, she said. 3 horses, shod. They circled the cabin. They sat in the timberline, watching the smoke. They are gone now, back toward town. She held up the arrow. This was a warning. They know she is here. The debate was over. The storm had arrived. Jack looked at Nora. He looked at the warm stove. He looked at the arrow in Ayanna's hand. He was a man who had sworn off traps, and he had just walked into the biggest one in Montana. He gave a single, curt nod. It was not agreement. It was surrender. "The loft," he said, his voice a low gravel. "Go!" Nora looked from him to Ayanna, and for the first time, a small flicker of hope returned to her eyes. She nodded, grabbed her spice box, and climbed the ladder into the darkness of the loft. Jack sat back down at the table. He stared at the empty plates. He had agreed. He had let her stay. He told himself it was only for safety. It was only until the tracks faded. He would keep his distance. He would not let her near. But the cabin was warm, and it smelled like cornbread, and his old, cold vow already felt like a lie. The ride to Gray Butte was silent. Jack led his horse, with Nora riding. Ayanna rode her own pony, her eyes constantly scanning the ridgeline. The air was cold, but the sun was bright, making the snow in the valley glitter. It was a beautiful, false morning. Jack had insisted on this. They needed flour. They needed coffee. He had told himself he was taking Nora to town as he had promised, to hand her over to the law. But the brass casing was heavy in his pocket. He knew the judge was Kane's man. He was walking into a trap, but it was the only move he had. He could not keep her in his cabin forever. That thought sent a different kind of chill through him. Gray Butte's main street was a rutted track of mud and frozen earth. When they rode in, the town stopped. It was not a loud stop. It was a quiet cessation of movement. The blacksmith's hammer paused in mid-swing. The men lounging on the porch of the general store stopped whittling. Women, bundled in shawls, turned their heads. They were not looking at Jack. They all knew him, the widower mountain man who kept to himself. They were not looking at Ayanna. They feared her, respected her, or hated her, but they were used to her. They were all looking at Nora. They saw a young woman, her face pale and her clothes smudged from the trail. They saw her riding Jack Moran's horse. They saw her flanked by the mountain man on one side and the Crow warrior on the other. The town of Gray Butte, in one collective, silent moment, passed its judgment. Jack felt the weight of their eyes. It was a physical thing, heavier than his winter coat. He kept his own eyes forward, his face set like stone. He was leading her to the judge's office, a small building at the end of the street. But he never made it. A voice, smooth and practiced, cut through the silence. "Mr. Moran, a moment of your time." Deacon Pierce stepped off the boardwalk. He was a tall man, thin as a rail, who dressed in stark black. His face was narrow, and his eyes were the color of the ice on the river. He held his Bible in one hand, his finger marking his place. Jack stopped. He had no choice. Deacon Pierce did not look at Nora. He looked at Jack. His expression was one of profound, practiced sorrow. "My son," he said, his voice carrying for the benefit of the watching street. "We have missed you at service. The Lord's house is cold without the presence of all his flock." "It is cold everywhere. Deacon," Jack said. His voice was rough. The deacon's gaze flickered to Nora. "Just for a second." "Indeed, but a man's soul, Jack, that is the true hearth, and it must be kept pure." He took a step closer. "There is talk, a good man like yourself, a man burdened by grief. It would be a terrible thing to see you led into temptation." "I am not led anywhere," Jack said. "This young woman," Pierce continued, as if Jack had not spoken. "She appears to be in distress. The town council has a fund. We have a room for wayward women, for her own good, for her virtue. It is best she be given into the care of the church, to avoid talk." Nora's hands tightened on the saddle horn. She stared at the deacon, her fear visible. Before Jack could answer, another voice joined them. This one was not smooth. It was rich and warm, like whiskey by a fire. "Deacon, you are always so thoughtful, worrying about everyone's virtue." Luther Kane emerged from the hotel. He was the opposite of the deacon. He was broad, dressed in a fine wool suit, a heavy gold chain draped across his vest. He was smiling, his teeth white. He looked like a man who had just enjoyed an excellent breakfast. He walked toward them, and the crowd on the street seemed to lean in. Kane was power. Pierce was the soul. But Kane was the body. He owned the town. He stopped and looked up at Nora. He removed his hat, a polite, almost fatherly gesture. "My dear," he said, his voice full of concern, "you must be Lenora Finch. We have been so worried. A girl, all alone, lost from her wagon train. I am Luther Kane, president of the freight line. Your employer. I have been terribly concerned for your safety." Nora was frozen. She could not speak. Kane looked at Jack. "Thank you. Moran, thank you for bringing my lost employee back to me. We will take her off your hands. My men will see she has a hot meal and a safe room at the hotel until we can find her proper lodgings." It was all so reasonable, so polite, so final. Jack looked from Kane's smiling face to the men who had stepped out of the hotel behind him. One of them was a big man with a dull, flat expression. He was wearing a red scarf, loosely tied, and running from his right eye to his jaw was a thick, pale scar that pulled his mouth into a permanent sneer. It looked just like a hook. The man with the scar looked at Jack. Then his eyes slid to Nora. There was nothing polite in his gaze. It was a look of possession, of a job unfinished. Jack's eyes locked with the man's. The world shrank to the few feet between them. This was the man. This was the man who had burned the wagons. This was the man hunting her. Ayanna made a sound. It was barely a whisper, a string of absolute words. She was speaking to Jack. He did not know the language. Not all of it, but he knew the tone. It was a warning. It meant trap. It meant death. "If they hand Nora over, she will be dead by nightfall." Jack turned his gaze back to Kane. He felt the brass casing in his pocket, pressing against his leg. He looked at the deacon, who was smiling his thin, righteous smile. He looked at the man with the scar, and he looked at Nora, her face white with a terror that was beyond screaming. His vow, his peace, his empty cabin, it was all balanced on this one moment. He took a slow breath. "That is kind of you, Mr. Kane, but she is not your employee. Her contract was with a wagon train. That train is gone." Kane's smile did not change, but his eyes went hard. "She signed papers with my company. Moran, I feel responsible for her." "She is not your responsibility," Jack said. His voice was quiet. "She is mine." The silence on the street was absolute. Jack had just drawn a line in the frozen mud. Deacon Pierce gasped, a small, theatrical sound. "Mr. Moran, this is improper. You, an unmarried man." "She will be staying with Lydia," Jack said. "Lying." He had not spoken to the midwife, but it was the only name he could think of. "Lydia will look after her." Kane's smile finally faded. He put his hat back on, his movements slow and deliberate. "Lydia's a good woman, but she is old. This is a dangerous territory, Moran. A lot of bad men out here." He gestured to his scarred man. "My men work hard to keep this town safe, but we cannot be everywhere." He looked up at the sun. "You should think hard on your decision. The sun sets fast in these mountains. It gets cold. People get lost." He nodded to the deacon. "Come, deacon. Let us leave this gentleman to his, conscience." The two men turned and walked away. Kane's heavy steps sure on the boardwalk, Pierce's thin ones hurrying to keep up. The man with the scar gave Jack one last, long look before following. The crowd on the street began to move again. The moment was over. But the air was different. The whispers had already begun. "Jack Moran has a woman." Jack did not move. He let the tension drain out of him. He had just declared war. "We need flour," Ayanna said, her voice flat. She had already moved on. They walked to the general store. The owner, Mistress Gable, was a woman whose face had soured from years of chewing on gossip. She watched them as they entered, her hands on her wide hips. "Jack," she said, nodding curtly, her eyes fixed on Nora. "And company." "Flour," Jack said. "Coffee, bacon." As Ayanna gathered the supplies, Mistress Gable leaned over the counter toward Nora. "You look peaked, dearie," she said, her voice a loud whisper. "It is a hard life, up in the mountains, a lonely life, not a place for a woman of morals." Nora's chin came up. She had been silent through the entire confrontation with Cain, but this woman, this busybody with her mean eyes, had found her voice. Nora unslung her pack. From it, she took a small bundle wrapped in cloth. She opened it. It was a small loaf of cornbread from the night before, cold now, but still fragrant. She had packed it, a cook's habit. She placed it on the counter. "I find morals are like bread, Mistress Gable," Nora said, her voice clear and calm. "They are better when they are warm, and they are meant to be shared, not locked away." A few miners at the back of the store, who had been listening, went quiet. One of them coughed to cover a laugh. Mistress Gable's face turned the color of a bad beet. She was speechless. Ayanna placed the supplies on the counter. Jack paid in pelts, his face giving nothing away. But as they left, he held the door for Nora. The rumor was moving faster than they were. Jack Moran brought a woman to his cabin. It was in the saloon. It was in the blacksmith shop. It was in the church. It was an invisible wall, building itself around them. Jack felt it. He was an outcast by choice, but this was different. This was a shunning. He had to get Nora out of his cabin. The lie he had told Cain gave him an idea. "We will go to Lydia's house," he said to Ayanna. "The midwife, she is a good woman. She fears no one, not Cain, not the deacon. She will keep Nora safe." Ayanna nodded. It was a good plan. Lydia's house was a small, clean cottage at the edge of town. They tied the horses to the rail. Jack was about to lead Nora to the door, to knock, to beg for this favor. He stopped. He looked at his horse. Then he looked at the saddle Nora had been using. The main cinch strap, the thick piece of leather that held the saddle to the horse, had been cut. It was sliced nearly all the way through, hanging by a thread. It was a clean cut, done with a sharp knife. It would have held for a mile, maybe 2, but on the first steep incline, on the slick rock of the trail back to his cabin, it would have snapped, the saddle would have rolled, and Nora would have been thrown down into the rocks. Someone had done this while they were in the store. One of Cain's men, the man with the scar. It was not a warning. It was an execution. Jack stared at the cut leather. He saw Nora's body falling. He felt a rage so cold and so deep it almost choked him. It was a feeling he had not had since Ellen died. He looked at Ayanna. She was already inspecting her own pony. Her saddle was untouched. They had targeted Nora. They did not even wait for the sun to set. Ayanna said. Jack turned away from Lydia's door. There was no safety in this town. The church, the law, the people. They were all either owned by Cain or too scared to stand against him. He put his hand on Nora's arm. She flinched, startled. He took his hand back. "We are leaving," he said. "To Lydia's?" she asked. "No," he said. He took a knife from his belt and, in one swift motion, cut the damaged strap completely off. He threw the useless piece of leather into the mud. "We are going back to the cabin." He retied the saddle using rope from his pack. It was a rough fix, but it would hold. "Ayanna," he said, "right ahead. Watch our back." She nodded. She was on her pony and gone in a second. Jack put his hands up to help Nora mount. She hesitated. She looked at his face. It was no longer the face of a man hiding from his grief. It was the face of a man preparing for a siege. She put her small, soot-stained hand in his large, calloused one and let him lift her onto the horse. They rode out of Grey Butte. Jack walked beside the horse, his rifle in his hand. He did not look at the people who watched them go. He did not care about their whispers. He had not wanted this. He had sworn to stay out of the world of men, of women, of pain. But the world had come to his door. It had sent a warning arrow. And now, it had cut his saddle. Luther Kane thought he was a broken man, a widower hiding in the hills. He was about to find out how wrong he was. Jack Moran, despite every vow he had ever made, was in the fight. The ride back to the cabin was brutal. Ayanna had met them just inside the timberline, her face grim. She had cut a wide circle on her return from town, and what she found was not good. "More tracks," she said, her voice low as Jack and Nora rode up. "Not the 3 from last night. A different group. To the west, in the high rocks. They are watching the valley." Jack looked west. He could see nothing but snow and stone. "Kane," he said. It was not a question. "He is tightening the net," Ayanna said. Jack merely nodded. He looked up. The bright, false sun was gone. The sky had lowered, turning a uniform, bruised gray. The air was still, heavy with a terrible promise. "And the sky is closing," Ayanna added. "We must hurry." They made the cabin in less than an hour, the horses straining. Jack quickly put the animals in the lean-to stable. Giving them extra feed, he barred the heavy door. He, Nora, and Ayanna entered the cabin. Jack barred that door, too. He had barely finished setting the bar when the wind hit. It did not rise, it simply arrived. A solid wall of sound and ice. The cabin, which had stood for a decade, groaned as if struck. The world outside the 2 small windows vanished, replaced by a churning, screaming white. The blizzard had come. It did not let up for 4 days. For 4 days, the 3 of them were trapped in the single room. The wind was a constant, high-pitched howl that strained the nerves. They could not see 10 feet from the door. On the first morning, Jack and Ayanna moved like the predators they were. They checked their rifles. They checked the ammunition. They sat by the windows, peering into the white void, taking turns. They were coiled, tense, expecting an attack. Nora was not a warrior. She was a cook. She went to the stove. She took the small stores Jack kept and the new supplies they had just bought. And she performed a kind of magic. The cabin had been Jack's shell, a cold place to sleep. Nora, trapped by the storm, turned it into a heart. The big iron stove, which Jack had let sleep, was now kept blazing. It was the center of their world, a circle of heat and light. The cabin was filled, for the first time in years, with the smells of life. She baked cornbread every morning. She had a sack of venison, and she kept a heavy stew bubbling constantly. Adding herbs from her precious box, she brewed pots of strong coffee, and when the coffee ran low, she brewed a tea from pine needles and yarrow. Jack watched her. He sat apart, oiling his rifle, mending a strap, anything to keep his hands busy. He tried to maintain the cold, empty space around him, but he could not. The warmth filled it. The smell of baking bread filled it, and the quiet sound of the 2 women filled it. Nora and Ayanna, trapped together, formed an alliance. Ayanna, restless from being cooped up, began to teach Nora. She showed her how to braid her hair tight, in the crow fashion, so it would not fly in her face or get caught. She showed her how to tie a diamond hitch, a knot that would hold a pack on a bucking horse. She opened the door a crack, letting in a blast of freezing air, and pointed to the snowdrift. "You read the snow," Ayanna said, her voice clear over the wind. "The wind makes a pattern on the drift. See the sharp edge, the shelter is on the other side. You learn that. You do not die." Nora, in turn, taught Ayanna. Ayanna ate to live. Nora lived to cook. "The stew is good," Nora said on the second day, tasting it. "But the meat is lean. It needs a friend." She opened her spice box. The scent of rosemary and thyme cut through the smell of smoke. She crushed the dried herbs in her palm and dropped them into the pot. Ayanna watched her. Later, she tasted the stew. Her eyes widened, just slightly. It was not just food, it was comfort. Nora showed her how a pinch of cinnamon in the coffee could make it taste richer, how a bit of dried sage could make the tough bacon fat sing. Jack watched this exchange. He saw them smile, a brief, shared smile. He heard their low voices. He felt the cold ice that had packed itself around his heart begin to thaw, and the feeling was agonizing. It was a sharp, aching pain. He felt like an intruder in his own home. He would stand suddenly, put on his coat, and go out to check the horses, just to feel the honest, brutal cold on his face. On the third night, Nora was kneading dough for the next morning's bread. She spoke, her voice quiet. "My mother," she said, "she was a legendary cook. She worked the big cattle drives down south. She fed 20 men for 3 months out of a single wagon." Ayanna, who was mending a moccasin, grunted in appreciation. "She taught me everything," Nora continued, her hands working the dough. "She used to say that men on the trail were just scared boys. She said the cold and the dark and the distance made them hollow, and she taught me that a decent meal, a hot meal made right. It is a promise. It is a promise that we will be alive tomorrow." Jack, sitting in the shadows, heard her. He stopped his work. A promise that we will be alive tomorrow. He had not lived with that kind of promise since Ellen. He had been living day to day, expecting nothing. This girl, with her flour and her herbs, was speaking a language he had forgotten. Later that night, the storm found new teeth. It was long past midnight. Nora was asleep in the loft. Ayanna was dozing, sitting upright at the table. Jack was on watch. He heard it, under the scream of the wind. There was a new sound. The horses, a high, terrified whinny. Then a howl. It was not a distant wolf. It was at the stable. Ayanna was awake instantly, her knife in her hand. "Wolves," Jack said. He grabbed his rifle. He went to the stove and pulled 2 long branches of pitch pine from the wood box. He thrust them into the embers until they caught, blazing, a pack. "They smell the horses." He handed 1 torch to Ayanna. "Stay inside," he ordered Nora. "Bar the door behind us." Nora's face was pale in the firelight. She nodded, her eyes wide. Jack and Ayanna burst from the cabin into a white hell. The snow was in their faces, blinding. The wind tore the flames from their torches. They waded through the waist-deep drift to the stable. The pack was there, 8, maybe 10 of them. Gray shadows with yellow, hungry eyes. They were leaping at the stable door, clawing, trying to get in. Jack roared. He and Ayanna split apart, coming at the pack from 2 sides. They thrust the torches forward. The wolves snarled, backing away from the fire. One, a large, dark male, lunged at Jack. He met it with the rifle, firing from his hip. The explosion was flat and dead in the thick snow. The wolf dropped. Another lunged at Ayanna. She did not shoot. She moved like a snake, jamming the burning torch straight into the animal's face. It shrieked, a terrible, half-human sound, and fell back, its fur smoking. Inside the cabin, Nora heard the shot. She heard the snarling. She was terrified. She looked around. She was not a fighter. She was a cook. She grabbed the heavy iron lid lifter from the stove. She grabbed the biggest pot. She stood in the center of the room and she began to bang them together. Clang, clang, clang! It was a horrible, unnatural, rhythmic noise. It was the sound of iron. The wolves, caught between the fire in their faces, the smell of gunpowder, and the terrifying metal thunder from the cabin, broke. They turned and vanished, swallowed by the white. Jack and Ayanna checked the horses. They were frantic, kicking the stalls, but they were unharmed. Breathing hard, they plunged back into the cabin. They barred the door, shaking the snow from their coats. The warmth hit them. Nora was standing by the stove, her knuckles white. She was still holding the pot and the lifter. She was shaking. Jack looked at her. He nodded once, a quick, sharp gesture of respect. "That was smart," he said. He turned to reload his rifle. Ayanna went to the fire to dry her leggings. Nora put the pot down. The silence in the cabin was thick. She took a deep breath. She looked at Jack's back. "Teach me," she said. Jack turned. "Teach you what you did fine." "Teach me to shoot," she said. Her voice was steady now. "Teach me to use that." She pointed to the old carbine that hung on the wall. "I will not be a burden. I will not be the one who bangs a pot. I will not hide." Jack stared at her. This girl was full of surprises. He looked at Ayanna. Ayanna nodded. "She should know," she said. Jack let out a long breath. "Fine. In the morning, if the storm lets up." The next day, the wind was still high, but the snow had lessened. They could see the trees again. Jack took the carbine from the wall. He showed her the mechanism. He showed her how to load the shells, how to check the safety. His voice was a flat, clinical monotone. "It is not a tool. It is a weapon. You respect it," he said. "You hold it tight. Brace it against your shoulder. If you hold it loose, it will break your bone." Nora took the heavy rifle. It was awkward. She tried to lift it, to aim it at the far wall. She was holding it loosely, like a broom. "No," Jack said. His patience snapped. "Like this." He stepped behind her. He put his hands over hers. His left hand covered her small, calloused hand on the wooden stock. His right hand moved to her shoulder, to push the rifle butt in tight, and his other hand guided her finger to the trigger guard. He was suddenly, terribly aware of her. Her hands were warm. He could feel the fine tremor in her muscles as she tried to hold the heavy rifle. He could smell her hair. It smelled of wood smoke and the rosemary she had used in the stew. He was pressed against her back. A jolt went through him. It was sharp, unwelcome, and intensely alive. It was a feeling he had not allowed himself to have in 3 years. Ellen's face flashed in his mind. The grave, the frozen ground, the vow. No pretty woman, no pain. He ripped his hands away from her as if he had been burned. "Just hold it steady," he said. His voice was harsh. He stepped back, his face a cold mask. "Hold it, and breathe. Then squeeze. Do not pull." Nora was startled, confused by his sudden anger. She just nodded, her face pale, and tried to hold the heavy rifle as he had shown her. That night, Nora was asleep in the loft. The storm was finally dying, the wind a low moan. Jack sat at the table, staring into the open firebox of the stove. Ayanna sat across from him. She was sharpening her skinning knife on a whetstone. The only sound was the steady, rhythmic shing, shing, shing of the stone on the steel. "You are a fool," Ayanna said, not looking up. Jack did not move. "I am just tired." "You are a fool," she repeated. "You wear your sadness like a heavy winter coat. You think it keeps you warm. It does not. It is just a chain. It weighs you down." Jack's head snapped up, his anger flashing. "You know nothing about it." "I know," she said. She stopped sharpening. "I know you lost your woman. I know you buried her, but you buried yourself in that hole with her. You think this coldness keeps you safe. It only keeps you empty. I see how you look at the girl." "I made a promise," he said, his voice a low growl. "To Ellen. To stay clear, I will not feel that again. That pain." "You are afraid," Ayanna said. "I am not afraid," he shot back, his voice too loud in the small cabin. Ayanna finally looked up at him. Her dark eyes were clear, reflecting the small flame from the stove. "Yes, you are," she said. "But what are you afraid of?" "Jack, are you afraid you cannot save someone again, or are you afraid to love?" The question was a clean arrow. It hit the center of his chest. Jack had no answer. He turned his back to her and stared into the fire. The 4th day broke clear and bright. The world was new, covered in a thick blanket of white. It was beautiful, and it was deadly. Ayanna was gone before sunrise, a shadow on the new snow. Moving out to scout. She returned at noon. Jack was outside, clearing a path to the stable. Nora was scrubbing the stew pot, making the cabin clean. Ayana's face was hard. "It is worse," she said. Jack stopped, his shovel deep in the snow. "The storm covered the old tracks," Ayana said. "But there are new ones, many new ones." "Kane's men?" Jack asked. "Yes, the Copperheads. They are in the high pass. They have blocked the only way east. And the new group I saw 2 days ago, the ones to the west." "What about them?" "They are not hiding anymore. They have made a camp. They have built fires. I saw their lookouts. They are sealing the valley." Jack looked from Ayana to the cabin. The thin plume of smoke was rising from the chimney. A clear, gray signal of life. A signal of where Nora was. He understood. This was not a hunt. Kane was not just trying to scare them. He was not going to send his men in. He was going to wait. "It is a siege," Ayana said, confirming his thought. "He is waiting for us to starve, or to ride out into his guns." The warm cabin, which had been a shelter, was now a trap. The siege held for a week. The snow from the blizzard melted under a warming Chinook wind, turning the world to a heavy, sucking mud. But the men in the high passes did not move. Inside the cabin, the mood was as heavy as the mud outside. They were trapped. The flour was low. The coffee was gone. Nora, the cook, was the first to understand what this meant. She could stretch rations, but she could not create them from nothing. "We have 3, maybe 4 more days of food," she said on the 8th morning, her voice flat. "Then it is the horses." Jack was pacing the small room. He felt the walls closing in. He had faced starvation before. He had faced the cold, but he had always been able to move, to hunt. This sitting and waiting was a kind of death he had never learned to endure. "We cannot wait," he said, his voice a low growl. "They will not get tired. They are paid to wait." "We cannot ride out," Ayana said from her spot by the window. She was polishing her rifle, her movements economical and smooth. "The snow is gone from the valley floor, but it is still deep on the slopes. We would be dark targets against the white. They would pick us off before we went a mile." Jack slammed his fist against the log wall. "Then what we fight our way out?" 3 against... "How many?" Ayana asked. 10, 20. We would not get far." They were silent. The only sound was the shush of Ayana's oil rag on the rifle barrel. It was Nora who spoke. She had been staring into her empty spice box, her brow furrowed in concentration. "The night of the fire," she said, her voice quiet. "I keep thinking about that night." Jack turned. "What about it?" "The smell," she said. "I told you. I thought it was just the wagons. But it was not. It was something else. Something they used to make the fire burn so hot, it was sharp." She looked up, her eyes clear. "It was pine tar, the kind they used to seal barrels." Jack frowned. "Why would they use pine tar to burn wagons?" "It burns black," Ayana said, her hands stilling. "It makes a fire look bigger than it is. It hides what is truly burning, or what is not." The 3 of them looked at each other. The same thought sparked between them. "Insurance," Jack said. "Kane, the freight company." "He has a warehouse," Nora said, her voice quickening. "A huge one, by the mine. He would have barrels of it. He ships everything." "If we could get in," Jack said, his mind racing. "If we could find the ledgers. Proof he sent the tar to the wagon train. Proof he filed for insurance." "It is the only way," Ayana said. She stood up. The rifle was clean. "We cannot run, so we attack, but we do not attack the men. We attack the paper. We attack his office." The plan was suicide, but it was better than sitting. "Tonight," Jack said. "The new moon. It will be dark." Ayana shook her head. "We do not go down the valley. They are watching the valley. We go over the high ridge, the goat path. It will bring us out above the mine." That night, they moved. They left the cabin dark, a single log burning in the stove to send up a thin wisp of smoke, a lie to the men in the pass. The climb was hell. The goat path was narrow, slick with melting ice and mud. Ayanna moved like a spirit, silent and sure. Jack, a bear of a man, was solid, testing every foothold. Nora was terrified. Her hands were raw. She was a cook, not a mountaineer. At one point, her foot slipped. She slid, a small cry torn from her throat. Jack caught her. His hand shot out, grabbing the front of her coat, hauling her back against the rock wall. He held her there for a second, his body shielding hers. He could feel her heart hammering against his chest. "Do not look down," he whispered, his voice rough. "Only look up. Follow Ayanna." He let her go, pushing her forward. His hand was shaking. It took them 3 hours. They were freezing, covered in mud, but they were above the town. They lay on a rocky outcrop, looking down at the dark shape of Kane's operation, the mine, the smithy, and the long, low shadow of the warehouse. "2 guards," Ayanna whispered, pointing. "One at the main gate, one patrols." "I will create a diversion," Jack said. "Draw them east. Give me 10 minutes. "No," Ayanna said. "You are strong. You and she will break the lock. I am fast. I will make the noise. A bear in the stables. They will both go." Before Jack could argue, she was gone. She slipped into the shadows, moving toward the small corral where the mine's mules were kept. Jack and Nora crept down the slope to the back of the warehouse. They pressed themselves against the rough pine boards. The night was dead silent. Suddenly, from the east, came a crash, the sound of a heavy wooden rail splintering. Then the high-pitched braying of frightened mules. Shouts. "What in damnation? It is a bear, get a light." They heard the heavy boots of both guards running toward the stables. "Now," Jack said. He put his shoulder to the small back door. It was locked. He used a heavy pry bar he had carried. The wood splintered. The lock popped. He pushed Nora inside. "Find it," he said. The warehouse was a cavern of shadows. It smelled of rope, grain, coffee, and axle grease. "The smell," Nora whispered, casting about. "It is this way." She led him past stacks of flour and crates of dynamite. In the far corner, she stopped. "Here." There was a section of barrels, stacked high. Jack struck a match. The small flame illuminated the stenciling on the wood. "You, Army surplus, pine tar." Nora pointed, her hand shaking. "That is it." "Army surplus," Jack growled. "He is stealing from the government, too." "The office?" Nora said, pointing to a small, glassed-in room. Jack broke the door with one kick. He lit the lantern on the desk. Nora was past him in a second. She did not look at the money box. She went straight for the shelf of ledgers. Her hands, raw from the climb, leafed through the heavy pages. "Shipping," she muttered. "Shipping, here." Her finger ran down the columns. Jack held the lantern over her shoulder. He was terribly aware of her again, the smell of her hair. "There," she whispered, her voice trembling with a cold fury. "Sweetwater Creek. 2 days before our train left, 10 barrels, pine tar, listed as wagon repair supplies." She grabbed another book, a thinner one. "Insurance filed 2 days ago. Total loss, wagon train, fire." Jack stared at the careful script. "He burned them," he whispered. "He burned those people for insurance money." "And to stop them," Nora said. "They were settlers. They were going to claim the land by the creek, the land Kane wants for his new silver mine." A boot scraped on the gravel outside. A light flashed through the office window. "Someone is in there," a voice yelled. Jack blew out the lantern. He grabbed Nora's arm. "Go out the back." The main warehouse doors crashed open. Men poured in, their own lanterns swinging, casting wild shadows. "It is Moran get him." It was the voice of the man with the hook scar. Jack and Nora ran. They burst out the back door into the mine yard. A shot exploded. The bullet kicked up mud at Nora's feet. "This way to the creek!" Jack yelled. The yard was a maze of ore carts and machinery. They ducked behind a stack of timbers as 3 men ran out to cut them off. Scar was in the lead. Nora stumbled on a piece of rail, falling hard to her knees. Scar was on her. He grabbed her by the arm, hauling her up. "Gotcha, little cook," he snarled. He pressed his pistol to her head. Jack skidded to a stop, raising his rifle. "Drop it, Moran," Scar yelled, using Nora as a shield. "Drop it or she dies right here." Jack stared down his rifle barrel. He was frozen. Nora was terrified, but she was also filled with a rage that burned hotter than her fear. She looked at the man holding her, the man who had burned her friends. She drove her elbow back, jamming it into his ribs. He grunted. The wind knocked out of him. His grip loosened. Nora twisted, not to run, but to fight. She clawed at his face. He backhanded her, sending her sprawling. But as she fell, her hand closed on the red scarf tied around his neck. She ripped it free. Scar roared in fury. He raised his pistol to shoot her as she lay in the mud. Twang. An arrow, black-fletched, appeared in Scar's wrist. It did not go deep, but it hit the nerve. His gun clattered to the ground. He howled, clutching his hand. Ayanna. She was on the roof of the assay office, a dark silhouette against the stars. The other 2 guards turned, raising their rifles to the roof. Jack did not give them the chance. He fired. Boom! Boom! 2 shots! The men fell. He lunged, grabbing Nora from the ground. "Run!" he yelled. He half dragged, half carried her. They plunged into the icy water of the creek, using the deep gully as a trench. Ayanna dropped from the roof and ran, following them, a shadow covering their retreat. They did not stop until they were back in the cabin, the door barred, the room pitch black. Nora was sobbing, a deep, racking sound of terror and release. Jack was breathing like a bellows. Ayanna was already at the window, watching. "They will come now," Ayanna said. "Not just the Watchers, all of them. The war is here." "Let them," Jack said. He lit the lamp. Nora was on the floor, her hands muddy. In her fist, she was clutching a soaked, dirty piece of red cloth. "I got this," she panted. "I got his scarf." Jack looked at it. "Good, good." He ran his hands through his hair. "The ledgers. We left the ledgers." The triumph died. They had failed. "It does not matter," Nora said, pushing herself up. "I saw them. I saw the entries. I remember the dates. I am the witness. And this." She held up the scarf. "This proves I was there. This proves he was there." "It is your word, girl," Jack said, his voice heavy. "Your word against Luther Kane and the deacon. The judge will burn this scarf and lock you up." "Then we do not go to the judge," Ayanna said. "We go to the people. We go to Tom Wheeler." Jack looked up. Wheeler, the old rancher. He hated Kane. He had a conscience. "And Lydia," Jack said. "The midwife. She knows all the secrets. She fears nothing." The plan shifted. They could not win with guns. They had to win with the truth. Ayanna went, slipping out before dawn. She was the only one who could make it to Wheeler's ranch unnoticed. She returned 2 hours later. "Wheeler will meet," she said. "But not here. He says the town is crawling with Kane's men. He will meet at Lydia's. Tonight. He will bring his rifle." They snuck back into Gray Butte. It was more dangerous than the warehouse. They moved through alleys, in the shadows of the very buildings Kane owned. Lydia's house was dark. Ayanna gave a low whistle, like a night bird. The door opened a crack. "Get in, you damn fools," Lydia's voice rasped. She was a tiny woman, her face a map of wrinkles, but her eyes were sharp as new nails. Tom Wheeler was sitting at her small kitchen table, a shotgun across his knees. He was a big, weathered man. Lydia says you have a story, Wheeler said, his voice a low rumble. Nora stood in the center of the room. And, she told him, the wagon train, the fire, the hook-scarred man, the smell of pine tar, the warehouse, the army barrels, the ledger entries, the insurance book. Then she laid the wet, muddy, red scarf on the table. I took this from him, she said, when he tried to kill me. Wheeler picked up the scarf. He looked at the mud on it. He looked at Nora's bruised face. He looked at Jack. You back this moron. I was there, Jack said. I saw the barrels. I saw the man. It is the truth. Wheeler was silent for a long time. Then he slammed his huge fist on the table. I knew it. That bastard. He is burning people out. I will not stand for it. What can we do? Nora asked. We call a meeting, Wheeler said. A real one. Not in Kane's courthouse. In the street. I will bring every independent rancher I know. We will have our own trial. He looked at Nora, his eyes kind but hard. But it rests on you, girl. You will have to stand up. In front of everyone. In the middle of the market. And you will have to tell them what you just told me. Nora was shaking. To stand up, in the open, where Scar could see her. She nodded. I will. The meeting was set for 2 days' time, but Kane was already moving. The next day was Sunday. Deacon Pierce stood at his pulpit. The church was full. He had heard the whispers. He knew Wheeler was gathering men. There is a cancer in our midst, Pierce shouted, his thin voice rising. A sickness of the soul. I see a man lost to grief, who has turned his back on God. I see him take an unholy woman into his home. He did not use their names. He did not need to. And now this harlot, this sinner, dares to speak lies against the very man who built this town. She seeks to poison you against Mr. Kane, a good, God-fearing man. The sermon was brutal. It was aimed at one person. He was turning Nora into a liar, a whore, a temptation sent by the devil. The townspeople listened. They looked at each other and nodded. It was easier to believe. It was simpler. The news of the sermon reached the cabin by that afternoon. A friend of Lydia's had written out. Jack was quiet. He stood by the window, looking down at the town. He saw the trap. Kane would not use guns. He would use shame. He would have the women of the town tear Nora apart before she could even speak. Jack, Nora said, her voice small. He did not turn. Maybe we should wait, he said. Let this die down. Ayanna, who was checking the horses, snorted. It will not die down. It will burn. They will come for her. We could leave, Jack said, the words tasting like poison. We could ride north to the high country. He would not follow us there. I can keep you safe. He was offering to run, to take her away, to hide her, to save her. A man who had sworn to protect her, and he was offering to do it by giving up. Nora looked at him. And let him win. Let him do this to someone else. It is not our fight, Jack said, turning on her. His voice was torn. I just want you safe. He was hesitating. He was caught between his fear of losing her and his knowledge of what was right. He wanted to protect her, but he was choosing the wrong way. And in that moment of hesitation, Jack gave Luther Kane the opening he had been waiting for. The air in the cabin was thick with Jack's hesitation. He had offered to run, to hide her in the high country. And he had meant it as a kindness. But Nora saw it for what it was, a retreat, a surrender. Before she could answer him, before she could tell him that safety was not worth their silence, the world intervened. Nora, her heart aching from his words, turned to the meager supplies. We are low on everything, she said, her voice strained. The stew is flat. I saw yarrow and wild onion by the creek bed, just inside the trees. It is not far. I will be quick. No, Jack said instantly. You are not leaving the cabin. Then you will go, she asked. He was trapped. He could not leave, and Ayanna was the better scout. Ayana, who had been watching them both, stood up. "I will go. You two, talk." "No," Nora insisted. Her pride was stung. He saw her as a burden to be hidden. "You are the scout. I am the cook. Let me do my job. It is 50 yards. I will not be a child." Jack was torn. His fear of losing her, and his fear of admitting why, warred with the simple, practical need. He looked out the window. The creek was close. "Ayana," he said, his voice rough, "go to the ridge. Watch her. Stay high. Do not let her out of your sight." Ayana nodded. It was a compromise. Nora grabbed her basket, a tight, angry knot in her stomach. She slipped out the door and moved quickly toward the creek bed, her eyes scanning the ground for the green shoots. Jack stood at the window, his rifle in his hand. He watched her. Ayana moved like smoke, climbing the rocky ridge above the cabin to get a clear view of the creek. Nora found the patch of yarrow. She knelt, her back to the cabin, and began to pick. Her movements quick, her anger making her careless. She was angry at Cain, at the deacon, and at Jack for wanting to run. On the ridge, Ayana scanned the trees. She saw nothing. She looked down at Nora. Then she looked past her, toward the main valley. She saw movement, riders, but they were far off. A distraction. It was a mistake. The attack came from below, from the creek bed itself. 2 men from the Copperhead gang had been lying in the icy water for an hour, waiting. They had watched the cabin. They had seen Jack hesitate. They knew the routine. Ayana saw the movement too late, a flash of muddy canvas rising from the rocks. "Jack!" she screamed. Her voice was torn away by the wind. Jack, at the window, saw Nora stand up, a look of sudden, sharp terror on her face. He burst through the cabin door, roaring. But he was too late. The 2 men were on her. One grabbed her arms. The other clapped a calloused, filthy hand over her mouth. She fought, kicking and twisting, dropping her basket. Ayana fired her rifle from the ridge. The shot was high. A warning, meant to scare them. It did not. A 3rd man on horseback crashed through the trees. It was Scar. He was grinning. He swooped down. The men threw Nora onto the front of his saddle. Jack was running, firing as he ran, but they were already moving. "Nora!" he yelled, his voice raw. Scar reined in his horse for 1 second, just at the edge of the timberline. He looked back at Jack, who was running, stumbling through the mud, his face a mask of fury. Scar's grin widened. He reached into his coat, pulled out the muddy red scarf Nora had stolen from him, and tore it in 2. He let one half fall to the ground, a challenge, a taunt. Then he spurred his horse and was gone, the other men vanishing into the trees behind him. Jack stopped, his breath tearing at his lungs. He stared at the spot where she had been. Ayana was beside him, her face a mask of stone. "They are moving fast," she said. Jack walked, his steps heavy, to the timberline. He bent down and picked up the torn, dirty piece of red cloth. He closed his fist around it. He turned and slammed his fist into a pine tree. The sound was a wet, heavy thud. "My fault," he whispered. "I waited. I hesitated." He hit the tree again. "My fault." Ayana grabbed his arm. Her grip was like steel. "Stop it," she commanded. "Hating yourself will not save her. Action will. You told her you would hide her. They have hidden her. Go and find her." Her words cut through the fog of his guilt. "You are a mountain man," she said, her voice cold. "Track them, or you are just a widower hiding from the world. Choose." He looked at her. The grief and fear in his eyes burned away, replaced by a cold, sharp light. He was no longer a man hiding. He was a man hunting. "I know where they are going," he said. His voice was flat. "Devil's Fork. It is the only place close enough to hold her, and defensible enough to fight from." "I know it," Ayana said. "A box canyon. Hard to get in, hard to get out." They think we are ranchers, Jack said, turning back to the cabin. He began checking his rifle, his movements fast and precise. They think we will come from the front, but we will not. We will come from above. You are Apsaluk. I am a trapper. We will hunt them. They did not rest. They did not talk. They moved. Ayanna on her pony, Jack on his horse, tracking the trail of the 3 riders. They tracked them for 2 hours. Into the high, broken rocks. They reached the ridge above Devil's Fork by mid-afternoon. They tethered the horses in a grove of trees and crept to the edge. They looked down. The camp was small, a temporary hideout. There were 5 men, including Scar. They had a fire going. Nora was there. She was alive. She was tied to a small scrub pine, her hands bound in front of her. Jack's entire body went rigid. He wanted to raise his rifle and start firing. Ayanna put a hand on his arm. Wait, you are strong. I am quiet. What is the plan? Trapper. Jack took a long, slow breath. He forced the rage down. He forced himself to see the landscape, the sheer rock walls, the narrow entrance, the single exit, the same way they came in. They have no rear guard, Jack said. They expect no one to come from the cliffs. You are a panther. You will go down the rock face. Get as close as you can. Wait for my signal. And you, she whispered. Jack pointed up, to the loose scree and deadfall timber balanced precariously on the cliff edge, directly above the camp's entrance. I am a bear. I will set a trap. When they run, I will bring the mountain down on them. Ayanna nodded. Good, we hunt. She slipped away, disappearing over the edge of the cliff, using handholds a goat would have scorned. Jack moved, fast and heavy, climbing to the ridge above the entrance. He began to work, using his knife and a heavy branch as a lever, shifting the key rocks, setting a deadfall trap that would bury the canyon mouth. Down in the canyon, Nora was terrified, but she was also furious. Scar was sitting by the fire, drinking coffee. The boss is not happy you ran, girly. Scar sneered at her. He wants to talk to you, and he wants Moran dead, that fool, thinking he could stand against Mr. Kane. Nora ignored him. She looked around. She saw the camp kitchen, a field stove, sacks of flour, and a small, open barrel. She smelled it. Pine tar, the same smell from the warehouse. She began to work on her ropes. Scar had tied her, but he was arrogant. He was not a sailor. The knot was a simple, sloppy, square knot. Her hands were small, but she had a weapon. After the warehouse, she had been afraid. She had taken one of her smallest, sharpest paring knives from her kitchen roll and slipped it into the reinforced leather of her boot. She twisted, her back to the camp, pretending to be resting against the tree. Her fingers fumbled, found the handle. She eased it out. She began to saw at the rope, the blade hidden by her skirt. The rope parted. She was free. She did not move. What now, Run? They would catch her in a second. She looked at the fire. She looked at the pine tar. She looked at the sky. Ayanna and Jack were out there. They had to be. She needed a signal. She needed a diversion. She slid from the tree. She grabbed a handful of wet leaves from the creek bed. She threw them on the fire. A thick plume of white smoke billowed up. "Hey!" one of the guards yelled. "What are you doing?" Scar stood up. "The girl is loose." At the same instant, Ayanna, who had seen the smoke, loosed her first arrow from the rocks. It took the guard by the creek in the throat. He fell without a sound. On the ridge, Jack saw the smoke. He saw the arrow. It was time. He gave one final, heaving push on his lever. The rocks groaned. "Devil's Fork!" Jack roared, his voice echoing down the canyon. "This is your grave!" Scar and his remaining 3 men grabbed their rifles. They were trapped. Ayanna was on the rocks above them. Jack was at the entrance. "Kill her!" Scar screamed, raising his rifle. But Nora was already moving. She was not a warrior. She was a cook. She grabbed the heavy iron skillet, which was full of hot bacon grease, and through it, the skillet clattered, spilling grease. Then she did the one thing they did not expect. She grabbed a burning branch from the fire. She ran to the open barrel of pine tar. "No!" Scar yelled, realizing what she was doing. She thrust the burning branch into the barrel. It did not just burn, it exploded. A massive flume of black, sticky fire. It engulfed the two men nearest to it. Their screams were high and terrible. Jack was charging down the slope. He saw Nora. He saw the fireball. Scar, his face scorched, turned his rifle on Nora. He fired. Jack tackled him. They went down, rolling, a tangle of limbs and rage. They were two brutes, pounding each other into the mud. The last guard, his clothes on fire, raised his pistol. He aimed at Jack's back. "Jack!" Nora screamed. She ran at him. The guard fired. Nora threw herself forward. Pushing Jack aside, the bullet, meant for his heart, tore through the fleshy part of her left arm. She cried out, a sharp, terrible sound, and collapsed. The sound broke Jack's battle rage. He looked at Nora, at the blood spreading on her sleeve. He turned on Scar, his face inhuman. He hit him once, a sound like an axe splitting wood. Scar went limp. Jack did not check if he was dead. He ran to Nora. Ayanna was on the canyon floor. "Jack, the rocks!" The trap Jack had set was coming down. The roar of the rock slide was deafening. Jack scooped Nora into his arms. "Ayanna, the creek!" They ran, Ayanna covering their retreat. They plunged into the narrow, shallow creek bed as the entrance to Devil's Fork collapsed, burying the camp, the fire, and Scar's men under 100 tons of rock. They did not stop running. Jack carried Nora, his lungs burning, his heart a cold stone of fear in his chest. The sky, which had been clear, opened up. A cold, driving rain began to fall. They ran until they could not. They found shelter, a shallow cave under an overhang of granite. Jack laid Nora down gently on the dry stone. She was pale. The rain was turning to sleet. "She is burning," Ayanna said, touching Nora's forehead. "Fever from the wound." "Water," Jack said. He set his rifle down. He moved to Nora. "We have to stop the bleeding." He took his knife and slit her sleeve. The bullet had gone clean through. Grazing the bone, he was bleeding, dark and steady. He needed a bandage. He ripped his own shirt from his body, tearing the thick flannel into strips. His hands, the hands that had set the rock trap, the hands that had just beaten a man unconscious, were shaking. He tried to tie the bandage. He fumbled the knot. "Damn it," he whispered. He remembered, with a terrible, vivid clarity, bandaging Ellen. Her hands, frail and hot with fever. His own hands had been so steady then, numb, cold, efficient. Now, with Nora, he was clumsy. His fingers were thick. He was trembling. He looked at her, her face pale, her eyes closed. He realized, in that moment, what Ayanna had asked him. "Are you afraid you cannot save someone again, or are you afraid to love?" It was both, but the fear of loving was gone, burned away. All that was left was the raw, immediate, animal terror of losing her. It was worse than any pain he had ever felt. It was worse than the grief for Ellen, because this was happening now. He finally tied the knot, his touch rough but desperate. Ayanna stood at the mouth of the cave, her back to them, watching the rain. She was guarding them, but she had seen his shaking hands. She had seen the look on his face. She knew the vow he had made over that frozen grave was now just as dead as the man who had made it. Nora's eyes fluttered open. She looked at him. "You came," she whispered. "I will always come," he said. His voice was a rasp. The rain stopped near dawn. The world was washed clean, but the air was heavy. Ayanna, who had not slept, touched Jack's shoulder. "I will scout," she said. "See what the rock slide did. See if they know." She was gone for 2 hours. Nora was sleeping, her fever steady. When Ayanna returned, her face was grim. "It is bad," she said. Jack stood up. "Is Scar alive?" "Yet, he must have been thrown clear of the rock slide. He made it back to town. He is a liar. Jack, a good one." "What did he say?" "He said you are an animal. He said you have been holding Nora against her will. He said you lured his men into a trap and murdered them. He said you set the fire at the warehouse. And now this Kane is not waiting. He has called an emergency town meeting, a citizens' court. He is trying you. Jack, he is trying you in absentia for kidnapping and arson and murder." Jack stared at her. "He is trying me." "He has to," Ayanna said. "He is making the first move. He will find you guilty. Then he can post a bounty. You will be an outlaw, and he can take her back, rescue her as his property. The trial. It is happening right now." The news of the trial, of the $500 bounty on his head, settled into the small cave like a poison gas. Jack felt the walls pressing in. Kane had outmaneuvered him. He had twisted the rescue into a kidnapping, the fight for survival into a brutal murder. He was an outlaw. Ayanna stood at the mouth of the cave, a grim sentinel. "He owns the judge. He owns the law. Jack, we have no one." Jack ran a hand over his face. He felt a despair so cold it mimicked the grief he had lived with for 3 years. He had failed. He had dragged this girl into his own ruin. A soft sound, a pained breath, came from the back of the cave. Nora was stirring. Her eyes fluttered open, clouded with fever. She blinked, trying to focus. Her gaze found Jack. He was sitting on a rock, staring at the floor. His shoulders slumped in defeat. "Jack," her voice was a dry whisper. He was at her side in an instant, his own despair forgotten. "I'm here," he said, his voice rough. "Rest. Your arm is bad." She looked at the crude bandage, then back at his face. She saw the new lines of exhaustion, the dark stubble on his jaw, the hollowness in his eyes. "You have not eaten," she said. It was not a question. It was a fact. "It does not matter," he said. "It does." She tried to sit up, bracing herself with her good right arm. A sharp pain from her left shoulder made her gasp. "Stay still," he ordered, his hand moving to steady her. "My right arm is fine," she said, her voice stubborn. She pushed herself up until her back was against the cold granite wall. "The packs. Where are the saddlebags?" Ayanna, understanding, pushed the small, waterlogged bag toward her. It held what little they had, a small bag of cornmeal, a tin of salt, a coffee pot. Nora looked at the small, dead fire. "We need a fire, just a small one. I am so cold." "The smoke," Jack began to protest. "They will be looking—" "It is day," Ayanna said, her voice flat. She moved to the mouth of the cave. "The valley is full of mist from the rain. A small fire, smokeless wood. It will be lost." She began to build a new fire with the skill of a ghost, using dry twigs from the deepest part of the cave. Nora winced, reaching for the coffee pot with her good hand. She scooped water from their canteen. She fumbled with the bag of cornmeal, finally managing to pour a small amount into the water. She set the pot on the budding flames. She cooked. It was a painful, awkward process. She had to stir with her left hand, as her right held the pot steady. Every movement sent a jolt of fire up her wounded arm, but she did not stop. She bit her lip against the pain and she stirred. She stirred until the mush was thick and steaming. It was nothing. It was corn, water, and salt. She had no herbs, no bacon, no sweet butter. It was the meanest, poorest meal she had ever prepared. She poured it into 3 tin cups. She handed one to Ayanna, who took it with a nod of profound respect. She held the last one out to Jack. He looked at the cup. His world was ending. He was a wanted man. The town he had hidden from was now actively hunting him. And this girl, wounded, feverish, and hunted because of him, was offering him food. His hand, which had shaken so violently when he bandaged her, was steady as he took the cup. He looked at the steaming, pale mush, a lone mountain man who had sworn off every pretty woman, a man who had vowed to live cold and alone, to never again feel the pain of a warm hearth. He had fed his grief on cold bacon and stale bread for 3 years. And now, this girl, a virgin cook, not a woman of the world, but a girl who had never loved, who knew only the duty of the kitchen. She was serving him. She was serving him a gentle love, not the fire of passion that burned hot and fast. This was the steady, stubborn warmth of survival. This was a meal that was a promise, her mother's words. A decent meal is a promise that we will be alive tomorrow. He ate. The hot cornmeal was simple. It was basic. It was the most powerful thing he had ever tasted. It was life. It was a vow. He finished the meal in 3 long swallows. He set the empty cup down on the stone floor. He looked at his hands, scarred and rough. "When Ellen died," he said, his voice quiet, breaking the silence of the cave. "When I buried her in that frozen ground, I buried myself. I swore I would never feel that again. The pain, the loss. I thought if I stayed cold, if I kept my heart frozen, I would be safe." Nora watched him, her eyes wide, the fever making them too bright. She saw the raw, terrible honesty he was giving her. "I was afraid," he said. The words tore out of him. Ayanna was right. I was afraid to love again. I was afraid I would fail. I failed Ellen. I could not save her. He looked at Nora, at the blood-soaked bandage. "And I almost failed you." "You did not fail me," Nora whispered. "You came." "I was afraid of the pain," he said, the words a confession. "But living like I was hollow, empty, that is just another way of dying. A slower way." Nora, using her good right hand, reached out. She did not touch his face or his shoulder. She laid her small, calloused hand over his massive, scarred one. His hand was like a piece of granite. Hers was warm, despite the fever. "Jack," she said, her voice clear and stronger than it had been. "I am not Ellen. I am not asking you for promises. I am not asking you to swear you will save me." She gave his hand a small, fierce squeeze. "I just want to cook for you when you come home. That is all." He looked at her hand on his. He felt the 3 years of ice inside him, the wall he had built, finally crack and fall away. He turned his hand over, his fingers, thick and rough, lacing with her small, practical ones. He leaned in. He was a man relearning a forgotten language. He was clumsy. He kissed her. It was not a kiss of passion. It was not the desperate kiss of a lover in wartime. It was gentle. It was quiet. It tasted of salt and cornmeal and the faint, metallic tang of her fever. It was a kiss of profound respect, of gratitude. It was a promise. He pulled back and rested his forehead against hers. He closed his eyes. "Nora," he breathed. "I know," she whispered. He pulled her into a hug, his arms going around her, so careful of her wounded arm. He just held her. She rested her head against his chest, smelling the smoke and the leather and the rain. She was safe. At the mouth of the cave, Ayanna watched them. She had seen the kiss. She had seen the embrace. A rare, almost imperceptible smile touched her lips. She turned her back to them, giving them their privacy. She stared out at the valley, a silent guardian. The small fire behind her was warm. They stayed that way for a long time, until Nora's steady breathing told him she was asleep again, her fever breaking, her body finally surrendering to rest. The sun was high when Ayanna returned from a scout. Jack had let Nora sleep. Ayanna carried something in her hand. She motioned for Jack to step outside the cave. "The town is quiet," she said. "The meeting is over. You are a wanted man. Jack, $500, dead or alive." Jack nodded. He had expected it. "Wheeler." He is waiting. He sent a boy out. He knows the trial was a sham. He is gathering the ranchers at his own place. But he needs you. Jack, he needs the witness." "I know," Jack said. He looked at the sun, high and bright. "I am done running." Ayanna looked at him. The change was profound. The haunted, hollow look was gone. The hesitation that had plagued him, the fear that had made him want to run north, was burned away. He was no longer a widower hiding from his grief. He was a man. She held out her hand. In it was a small, leather thong. Tied to it were two perfect, small tail feathers from a golden eagle. "In my tribe," she said, her voice low, "we do not hide in caves. When we choose our path, when we choose our family, we must stand in the sun and say it, so all can see, so the spirits can see." She held it out. It was a ceremony, a gift. Jack understood. He bowed his head. Ayanna tied the thong around his neck. The feathers rested on his chest, a small, warm weight. "Thank you, my friend," he said, his voice thick. "Do not thank me," she said. "Go and fight, not like a bear in a trap, like a man." He went back into the cave. Nora was awake. She was pale, but her eyes were clear. "Ayanna told me," she said, her voice small. "The bounty." "It is a lie," Jack said. He knelt beside her. "And we are going to end it. Today." "We are leaving?" she asked, her voice small, testing him. "Running north?" He touched the eagle feathers at his neck. "No, we are not running. We are going back. We are going to that town, and we are going to stand in the sun." "Jack, you are a wanted man," she protested, fear flashing in her eyes. "They will shoot you on sight." "They will try," he said. "But they will not be shooting a ghost. They will be shooting me. And I will have you, and Ayanna, and Tom Wheeler standing beside me. We have the truth. It is all we have. It has to be enough." He helped her to her feet. She was weak, but she stood, her jaw set. "The evidence," she said, her cook's mind clicking into place, practical and focused. "We need it." "We have it," Jack said. He pulled the torn, dirty half of the red scarf from his pocket. "We have this, we have my word, and we have you. You are the witness. You saw the ledgers." "The pine tar," she said. "The barrel I burned, it was from the warehouse. It had the army mark." "Ayanna," Jack called. "Go to the fork, fast. See if the explosion left anything. A piece of the barrel. Anything with the stencil." Ayanna was gone, a shadow. "We ride," Jack said. "Now." They rode into Gray Butte at high noon. Jack rode his own horse, tall and imposing. Nora rode Ayanna's pony. She sat straight, her arm in a crude sling Jack had made. Ayanna walked beside them, her rifle in her hand, her eyes scanning the rooftops, the alleys, the faces. The town stopped. It was not the quiet, judgmental pause of their last visit. This was a collective, shocked gasp. There he was. Jack Moran, the wanted man, the murderer. Deacon Pierce was on the street. He had just come from the saloon, congratulating Kane's men on their good work. He saw them, his face, thin and pale, turned white with shock, then red with righteous fury. "Blasphemy!" he shrieked, his voice cracking. He pointed a long, bony finger. "He is here the sinner. He dares to come back. He brings his harlot, the source of his corruption, back to this decent town." A crowd began to gather. Men poured from the saloon, their hands on their guns, eager for the bounty. Women came out of the general store, their faces hard and cruel, their minds poisoned by the deacon's sermon. "Shame!" one of the women yelled, echoing the deacon. "Shame on you, Jack Moran." Jack did not stop. He rode straight to the center of the street. He rode until he was directly in front of the town hall, the building where his false trial had been held. He stopped. He looked at the crowd. He looked at Deacon Pierce. Then he turned to Nora. She was trembling. Her face was ashen. The wall of hate was terrifying. Jack dismounted. He walked to her pony. The crowd watched, silent, expecting him to drag her down, to use her as a shield. He reached up. He did not grab her. He did not pull her. He put his large, gentle hands on her waist. "I have you," he whispered. Gently, carefully. He lifted her from the saddle. He did not set her on her feet. He cradled her in his arms, his one arm under her legs, the other supporting her back, protecting her wounded arm. He held her as a man would hold his wife. The crowd gasped. He turned, carrying her, and walked straight toward the hateful crowd. They parted before him, a wave of shock and confusion. He walked through them as if they were not there. He did not stop until he was at the wooden steps of the town hall. Tom Wheeler was there, just as he had promised. He was sitting on the top step, his shotgun across his knees. 10 other ranchers, hard-faced, silent men who hated Cain, stood behind him. They formed a solid line. Jack walked up the steps. He gently set Nora down on the top step. So she was sitting, looking down at the town. He remained standing beside her, his hand on her good shoulder. A protector, a partner. The air in the street was tight. It was a wire humming, ready to snap. Deacon Pierce was sputtering, his words lost in his rage. And then Luther Cain stepped out of his office. He saw Jack, free and standing in the sun. He saw Nora, alive. He saw Tom Wheeler and the ranchers, armed and ready. His polite, civilized smile was fixed in place, but his eyes were dead. The confrontation was set. The whole town was watching. Luther Cain stood on the boardwalk of his hotel, his civilized smile firmly in place. He looked at the armed ranchers on the steps of the town hall. He looked at Jack, standing tall and defiant. He looked at Nora, pale but alive. His plan had failed. Deacon Pierce, his voice shaking with a mixture of fear and fury, was the first to find his words. "This is a travesty, a public disturbance. This man, Jack Moran, is wanted for murder. He has a $500 bounty on his head." Cain raised a hand, silencing the deacon. He walked calmly into the street. "The deacon is correct," Cain said, his rich voice projecting to the entire crowd. "We have laws. We held a legal proceeding. This man is an outlaw." He gestured to the town hall. "We shall finish this inside, properly, with the law." He was trying to move the confrontation from the street, where Wheeler had power, back into the building he controlled. He nodded to the watery-eyed judge, who was already scurrying inside. Cain walked up the steps, tipping his hat politely to Nora as he passed. "Miss Finch," he said, as if she were a guest at a party. He entered the hall and took a seat in the front row. His men followed. The man with the hook scar swaggered in. His right hand was heavily bandaged, a thick, crude wrapping of cloth stained with ointment. He had been close to the pine tar explosion. He sat behind Cain, his one good hand resting on his gun. The bounty hunters and miners, smelling money and blood, crowded into the pews behind him. Tom Wheeler looked at Jack. "This is his place, son. He means to finish this his way." "He can try," Jack said. He turned to Nora. "Can you stand?" She nodded, her jaws set. Jack, Wheeler, and the ranchers followed them in. They filled the back rows, a solid wall of grim-faced men. Ayanna did not enter. She remained outside, a shadow, her rifle held ready. Deacon Pierce took his place at the front, not at a pulpit, but behind the judge's bench. He was running this, a court of moral outrage. "Jack Moran," Pierce began, his voice ringing with false authority. "You stand accused by this town. You are charged with the arson of the Cain warehouse, the brutal murder of 4 men, and the kidnapping of this woman, Lenora Finch. How do you—" Jack took a step forward. His voice was not loud, but it cut through the deacon's. "I am not here for your trial, Deacon," Jack said, The entire room went silent. "I used to live my life hiding," Jack said. He looked at the townspeople, at the miners, at the women who had called Nora a harlot. "I hid from this town. I hid from memory. I hid from life. I am not hiding anymore." He turned and put his hand on Nora's good shoulder. "This woman," he said, his voice clear, "is not my prisoner. She is a witness, and you will hear her." Nora stood up. She was weak. Her wounded arm was in its sling, a dark stain of blood visible on the white cloth. She looked small, feverish, and terrified, but her eyes were on fire. "My name is Lenora Finch," she said, her voice shaking but gaining strength. "I was the cook for a wagon train hired by the Kane Freight Company. 2 weeks ago, that train was attacked. It was burned." She looked at the front row. "But it was not a raid. It was an execution. I saw the man who led it." She pointed, her finger trembling, straight at Scar. "I saw him. He wore a red scarf. When it slipped, I saw his face, the hook scar." Scar just sneered. Kane looked bored. "I ran," Nora continued. "He hunted me. I found shelter with Jack Moran. When we went to the warehouse to find proof, we found the shipping ledgers. We found the barrels. United States Army surplus pine tar, shipped to the wagon train to burn it, to burn the people, for insurance money, and for the land they were going to settle." "Lies," Deacon Pierce shouted. "These are the ravings of a fallen woman." "Then how?" Nora said, her voice rising. "Did I get this?" With her good right hand, she reached into her pocket. She pulled out the torn, dirty, half of a red scarf, the one Jack had picked up. She held it high so the whole room could see it. "I took this from him," she cried, pointing at Scar again. "When he dragged me from the creek, this is his scarf." Scar, in his arrogance, had tucked the other torn half into his collar. He had kept it as a trophy. He had not expected her to be alive to show her half. The 2 pieces, one in her hand, one at his neck, were a perfect match. The same color, the same torn, ragged edge. The crowd gasped. They looked from the scarf in her hand to the one on his neck. Scar's hand went to his collar, his face turning dark red. Kane's smile tightened. "A piece of cloth proves nothing." At that exact moment, the main doors of the town hall opened. Ayanna stood there. She was framed by the bright noonday sun. She was no longer hiding. She walked down the central aisle, her moccasins making no sound on the floorboards. She carried something in her hands. She reached the front. She looked at Deacon Pierce with cold contempt. Then she dropped what she was carrying onto his desk. It was a piece of a barrel stave. It was scorched black, the wood splintered from an explosion, but on its curved surface, a stencil was still clearly visible, burned into the wood. My surplus, and below it, Netar. It was the barrel from Devil's Fork, the barrel Nora had blown up. Ayanna had gone back. She had brought the proof. Tom Wheeler stood up. His voice filled the room. "And I have seen the ledgers she speaks of. I know the accounting. I know Kane's signature. I know his accountant's signature. I say this woman speaks the truth. Kane has been robbing us, and now he has been killing." It was over. The scarf, the barrel stave, the testimony of a respected rancher. Kane was finished. He knew it. His smile vanished. He turned to Scar. He turned to the crowd of bounty hunters in the back. "He is a $500 outlaw," Kane roared, his voice suddenly savage. "She is a liar. Kill them both, and take the money." Scar's good left hand drew his gun. The men in the back row surged forward, their pistols clearing their holsters. Chaos! A bounty hunter leveled his gun at Jack's chest. A shot exploded in the room, deafening. The bounty hunter cried out, his pistol clattering to the floor. He stared at his hand, at the bloody ruin where his trigger finger had been. It was not Jack who had fired. Ayanna stood by the wall, a smoking revolver in her hand. She had drawn and fired in a single, impossible motion. Another man to her left raised his rifle. Ayanna fired again. The rifle's wooden stock splintered, the gun torn from his grip. 2 shots, 2 men disarmed. The rest of the bounty hunters froze. They looked at their wounded comrades. They looked at the silent, deadly Crow warrior. They looked at the 10 hard-faced ranchers, who now had their own shotguns leveled. The bounty was not worth it. Luther Kane was alone. His men were defeated. He looked at the door. He tried to run. Jack moved. He did not draw his gun. He was not an executioner. He was a trapper. He crossed the room in 2 strides and tackled Kane, bringing him down hard. Kane fought, a feral, cornered animal. But Jack was stronger. He was fueled by 3 years of cold grief and 1 day of burning, protective rage. He hauled Kane to his feet. He could have broken his neck. He wanted to. He looked at Nora, who was watching, her face pale. He took the rope from his belt. He bound Luther Kane's hands, pulling the knot brutally tight. He shoved the man, the Baron of Grey Butte, toward Tom Wheeler. "This is not for me to finish," Jack said, his voice heavy. "This is for the law." He looked at the ranchers. A real jury. Wheeler and 2 of his men grabbed Kane, whose face was a mask of disbelief and pure hatred. It was done. But, a voice stammered. Deacon Pierce was standing, his entire body trembling. His world had collapsed. His protector was bound. His moral authority was in tatters. He fell back on the only weapon he had left. "But the sin!" he shrieked, his voice high and thin. "The morality, you cannot ignore the sin. This woman, this adulteress, she lived in his cabin unmarried. She is a harlot. The town cannot stand for this." The crowd, which had been ready to follow Wheeler, paused. This was still a town built on hard piety. They looked at Nora. Nora, weak from blood loss and fever, pushed herself away from the wall. She faced the deacon. Her voice was not loud, but it was so clear that every person in the room heard it. "Deacon Pierce," she said, "you preach virtue. You demand purity." She gestured with her good hand toward Kane, who was now a prisoner. "But you took that man's money. You stood by him while he hired men to burn tents with families inside. You call me a harlot for sharing a roof while I was hunted, but you call him a leader while he stands in blood." She took a shaky step forward. "Tell me, Deacon," she asked, "which sin weighs more on God's scales, mine or yours?" The deacon had no answer. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. The townspeople stared at him. They saw him, truly for the first time, not as a moral guide, but as a hollow man, a coward. Tom Wheeler stepped up onto the porch. He was flanked by his ranchers. He had become the new authority. "This town," he boomed, "is done with snakes in the pulpit and tyrants in the office. We will send for a circuit judge, a real one, and we, the citizens, will see justice done." As if the land itself agreed. A sudden, strong gust of wind blew down the main street. It swept through the open doors of the town hall. It hit Deacon Pierce. It plucked the tall, black hat from his head. The hat tumbled, end over end, down the aisle. It rolled out the door, across the porch, and came to rest in a deep puddle of mud. Deacon Pierce just stood there, his bald head pale and naked under the light, his power gone. Jack walked back to Nora. The room was clearing. The ranchers were taking Kane to the town jail to hold him. The people were whispering. Their world turned upside down. Nora was leaning against the wall, her energy gone, her face clammy. Jack stood in front of her, in front of everyone who was left. He took her good right hand. He held it, firmly. He looked at the remaining townspeople, Mistress Gable, the judge, the blacksmith. "If any man here," he said, his voice low and final, "any woman, has a problem with this woman, you will speak to me." It was not a challenge. It was a fact. It was a declaration. The widower's vow was broken. A new one had just been made. Jack's declaration hung in the air of the town hall. He held Nora's hand, a silent, unshakable claim. The townspeople, their anger broken, their assumptions shattered, did not know where to look. They were ashamed. Lydia, the midwife, was the first to move. She pushed through the crowd, her face a mask of practical concern. "She is bleeding," Lydia said, her voice sharp, cutting through the confusion. She looked at Jack. "And you are a fool for letting her stand this long." She put her small, tough hand on Nora's forehead. "Fever! Get her to my house, now!" Jack did not need to be told twice. He put his arm around Nora's waist, supporting her. Ayanna took her other side. Together. The three of them walked out of the town hall, leaving the wreckage of Luther Kane's empire behind. The walk to Lydia's house was a new kind of spectacle. The crowd parted for them. The whispers were different now. Not of sin, but of awe. Mistress Gable, from the general store, watched from her window, her face pale. Lydia's house was warm. She sat Nora at her kitchen table and took charge. "Boil water," she ordered Jack. "Ayanna, find the blue jar in the pantry. Yarrow." Jack, who had faced down wolves and armed men, fumbled with the stove. His hands, which had been so steady in the fight, felt thick and useless. Lydia cut away the bloody sling and the ruined sleeve. She clucked her tongue. "Clean. The bullet went clean through. You are lucky, girl. A few inches over, and you would have lost the arm." She cleaned the wound. Nora bit her lip, her face white with pain, but she did not cry out. Jack stood by the table, a useless, hulking shadow, clenching and unclenching his fists. "You can stop guarding her, Moran," Lydia said, not looking up as she applied a thick, herbal salve. "She is safe here. Go, you have work to do." He looked at Nora. Nora, her good hand gripping the table, nodded. "Go, Jack, I am fine." He left. He did not want to. He stood on Lydia's porch for a full minute. Ayanna was sitting on the steps, calmly sharpening her knife. "She is safe," Ayanna said, "but the town is not. Go with Wheeler." Jack found Tom Wheeler at the jail. The ranchers had locked Kane in the single cell. The watery-eyed judge was there, wringing his hands. I cannot just—" the judge stammered. "You will close that mine," Wheeler said, his voice a low rumble. "You will put a seal on it, pending a full investigation by the circuit court. Or we will." The judge nodded, sweat beading on his forehead. "Yes, of course. The mine is closed." The news hit the Copperhead gang like a rock slide. Their pay was gone. Their leader was in jail. Their crimes were public. 2 of them were caught trying to ride out of town. The ranchers brought them to Wheeler. They were young, barely men, their faces scraped with fear. "We did not kill nobody," one of them pleaded. "We just followed orders. We just rode guard. We will testify. We will tell the circuit judge everything. Just do not let them hang us." The gang was broken. It dissolved overnight. The rest of them vanished, melting into the mountains, gone before sunrise. The next day, Deacon Pierce tried to enter his church. He found the heavy oak doors locked. He rattled the handle. "This is the house of God," he called out. Lydia was there. She was sweeping the wooden porch. She held the heavy iron key in her apron pocket. "It is," she agreed, not stopping her sweeping. "And it needs a proper cleaning. The floor is filthy." "You cannot keep me out," he shrieked. "I am not," Lydia said. "The town council is, and as the head of the New Citizens Fund, I am telling you the church is closed until we can air the smell of sulfur out of it." The deacon stared at her. He looked at the townspeople, who were watching him, their faces cold. He had no power here. He was just a hollow man in a black coat. He was gone by noon. He left on a rented mule, heading east, his tall, muddy hat jammed on his head. The town breathed. It was a clean, sharp breath. A few days later, Tom Wheeler and his ranchers met. They had taken control of the town's security, but they were cattlemen. They could not watch the high passes. Wheeler sought out Ayanna. He found her where she often was, on the ridge above the town, watching. He approached her with respect. "We need eyes," he said simply. "You see what we do not. We need a town patrol, a real one. We want you to be a part of it." Ayanna looked down at the valley, then back at him. "This town has been at war with my people for 10 winters. And your people have been at war with us," Wheeler countered, his voice not unkind. "You raid our cattle. We steal your water. It is a stupid fight. Cain was making it worse. He is gone. Let us end it." "Words," Ayanna said. "A treaty," Wheeler said. "A written one. The lower creek, all the water south of the fork, belongs to the Absoluk. The upper creek is ours. We ride together. We hunt the men who prey on both of us. We share the justice." Ayanna studied his face. She saw no lie. She saw a hard, honest man. She nodded once. "We will try." A new line had been drawn. Not a line of battle, but a line of agreement. Jack visited Nora at Lydia's house every day. She was healing fast, her youth and strength returning. She was already helping Lydia, cooking in the midwife's kitchen, her arm in a clean sling. But Jack was restless. He was a man without a center. His old cabin was just a box of wood filled with ghosts. He had no wish to return to it. One morning, he went to his shed. He unburied the cache he had kept for years. Bundles of prime beaver, marten and fox pelts, the savings of a lifetime of trapping. He loaded them onto his horse. He did not go to the freight office. He went to the judge. "I am buying land," Jack said. The judge, eager to please the town's new heroes, pulled out his maps. "Which parcel?" "The one by the creek," Jack said. "The south-facing slope, just below the timberline." It was the place where Nora had been picking herbs, the place where she had been taken. He was claiming it. He was taking the piece of ground where he had felt the worst fear of his life, and he was building a home on it. He sold his pelts to a trader from Bozeman. He used the money to buy the land, and to buy lumber, and glass for 2 windows. He began to work. He did not hire anyone. He did it himself. He dug the foundation, his back straining, the sweat cutting lines through the dust on his skin. He found and hauled the heavy, flat stones from the riverbed, setting them one by one. He was laying the first course of stone when Nora found him. She walked up the hill from Lydia's, her arm now free of the sling. She watched him for a while. He worked with a grim, focused intensity. He was a man possessed by a purpose. "It is a big foundation," she said. He stopped, resting on his shovel. He wiped his face. "It needs to be—" "What are you building, Jack?" she asked. He looked at the neat square of stones he had laid. "I am building a kitchen," he said, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. "A proper one, with a big stove and a window that catches the morning sun." Nora smiled. While Jack built the walls, Nora could not be still. The town was short on food, with the mine closed and the freight lines in chaos. She went to Wheeler. "I am a cook," she said. "Let me cook." She used the money she had earned from the wagon train. She set up an outdoor kitchen near Jack's building site. She did not have a building, so she built a fire pit. She hung her heavy cast-iron pots from a tripod. The miners, idle and restless, watched her. They were wary. She made one thing, the survivor's stew. She took the simple, life-giving cornmeal mush from the cave, but now she added chunks of venison that Ayanna hunted, and wild onions, and handfuls of herbs from her spice box. The smell drifted over the town. One by one, the miners came. They brought their tin cups, their hats, their hands. She filled them. They ate. They were silent at first. Then one of them, a big bearded man, let out a long breath. "Lord God," he whispered. He held out his hat for more. Soon, they were laughing. They paid her in what they had, a few cents, a pouch of tobacco, a silver nugget. Nora's kitchen, a simple pot over an open fire, became the new heart of the town. It was a way station for wagon trains, a meeting place for the miners. Ayanna, now a leader of the town patrol, found a new purpose. She was respected, not feared. The town children, who used to run from her, now followed her like a shadow. She took a liking to them. She found them by the creek. "You make too much noise," she told them. "A wolf would hear you from a mile." She began to teach them how to walk silently, how to read the track of a deer, how to fletch a small, straight arrow. In return, they taught her. They brought one of their school primers. They sat on a log, a half-dozen small, dirty children, and the silent crow warrior. "A," the oldest girl said, pointing. "A for apple." Ayanna, whose mind could map 1,000 square miles of wilderness, frowned in concentration. She painstakingly copied the letter in the dirt. It was a new kind of tracking, a new language. The house grew. Jack was a relentless builder. He was no longer working alone. One afternoon, Ayanna appeared, dragging a perfectly straight, massive lodgepole pine. "For the roof," she said. "It must be strong. It is the spine." Every day, at noon, Nora would walk over from her fire pit, carrying a plate of stew and a tin cup of hot coffee. Jack would stop. He would eat. He would watch her, moving around her outdoor kitchen, serving the miners, her face smudged with soot, her voice clear. He laid the final stone for the hearth. He looked at the structure. It was just a frame, but it was real. He saw what he was building. Ayanna was right. She was the spine, the ridgepole that held the roof against the wind. Nora was the hearth. She was the heart. One evening, as the air was turning warm with the promise of true spring, Lydia came to them. "It is time," she said. She, Jack, Nora, and Ayanna rode out to the burned remains of the wagon train, the place where it had all begun. They found the scorched earth. They found the graves, shallow and hasty, that the copperheads had dug. Jack and Wheeler had spent the day before building simple wooden crosses. They held a small, quiet funeral. There was no deacon. There was no Bible. Nora stood before the graves. She pulled her mother's leather-bound recipe book from her pocket. She turned to the back pages. "I did not know them all," she said, her voice quiet. "But I knew the family in the first wagon, the one they burned." She began to read. William Probst, his wife, Sarah, their son, Timothy, he was 8, Mary O'Shea, her sister, Elspeth. She read every name. She gave them back their lives. "Just for a moment." Jack stood beside her, his hat in his hand. He listened to the names. He thought of Ellen. He thought of his own frozen grave. He realized, as Nora spoke, that remembrance was not a prison. It was not a cold stone of grief. It was an honoring. It was a part of living. He felt the last of the ice in his heart finally, gently, melt away. Later that night, the wind blew, soft and warm. Through the open frames of the new house, Nora was asleep at Lydia's. Ayanna was on patrol. Jack sat at a simple table he had built. He lit a lantern. He took out a pen and a piece of paper. He began to write a letter to an old trapping partner he had not seen in 5 years. "Dear Ben," he wrote, "you will not recognize this place. You will not recognize me. I sold the pelts. I am building a house, a real one, by the creek. The town is breathing again, and I am too." He paused, looking out the open window at the stars. "I used to think a man was measured by what he could survive alone. I was wrong. I think I am finally home. There is a kitchen in this house, and there is someone here to cook in it, waiting for me to come back." The spring wind smelled of pine and damp earth, and the distant, promising scent of wood smoke. The house Jack built was finished. It sat on the slope by the creek, the stones of its foundation solid, the pine logs of its walls square and true. It looked, he thought, like it had always been there, grown from the earth instead of built upon it. He had built it strong, to stand against the Montana wind. But he had not built it as a fortress. He had built it as a home. The dark, cold cabin of his past was empty. He had taken nothing from it but his rifle and his blankets. This new house had 2 large glass windows, and the main room was dominated by the biggest, blackest cast-iron stove Nora had ever seen. It was a kitchen, the rest of the house, the sleeping rooms, the small sitting area. They were just additions to the heart of the home. The day it officially opened, they hung the sign. Jack had carved it himself, the letters rough but deep. Gray Butte Eatery. And above the name, the words he had learned from her, the words that had become their law: meals are promises. The eatery was more than a stop for miners. It was a way station for the new stage line, a meeting place for Wheeler's ranchers. It was the living, breathing center of the new Gray Butte. The final piece of the old Gray Butte was settled 6 weeks after Kane's arrest, when the circuit judge from Helena rode into town. He was a man with a hard face and clear eyes, and he held the trial on the steps of the town hall, in the open air. He listened to Nora Finch. She stood tall, her arm fully healed, her voice never wavering. She did not need the ledgers. She recited the entries from memory, the dates, the shipment of pine tar, the insurance claim. He listened to Tom Wheeler, who spoke of Kane's stranglehold on the town. He listened to Ayanna, who laid the scorched barrel stave at his feet. And he listened to the 2 young, terrified Copperhead men who, in exchange for their lives, described the massacre at the wagon train in chilling detail. The verdict took less than 10 minutes. Luther Kane was found guilty of arson, fraud, and 11 counts of murder. He was taken away in chains, his civilized mask finally gone, his eyes promising a hell he could no longer deliver. The judge was not finished. He seized every asset Kane owned: the mine, the hotel, the freight company. These properties, he declared, his voice ringing across the street, will be sold. The money will form a compensation fund. First, to find the families of those murdered at the Sweetwater Creek. What remains will go to the people of Gray Butte. You will establish a community fund, to build a school, and to hire a marshal who serves the law, not one man. The town, finally free, began to mend. The church, which had stood locked and silent since Deacon Pierce's departure, was opened. But Lydia did not call for a new preacher. She called a town meeting. She invited the ranchers, she invited the miners, and, for the first time in the town's history, she formally invited the elders of the Apsaluk, who came with Ayanna. The pews were full. It was an awkward, stiff gathering. These were people who had feared and fought each other for a generation. Ayanna stood at the front. She did not speak of sin. She spoke of the land. She spoke of the eagle, which sees all things from above. She spoke of honor, the Apsaluk ideal of it. Not a thing you said, but a thing you did. She told them the mountains did not care about the color of a man's skin. They cared only if he walked with a straight path, if his word was strong, and if he respected the water. The townspeople listened. They were learning a new kind of sermon. The house by the creek settled. It became their rhythm. Jack, who had once lived by the trap and the rifle, now found his hands busy with new tasks. He spent the long evenings by the fire, the light from the stove playing on his face. He was carving. His hands were huge, scarred, and built for an axe. This new work was slow. He was patient. One night, Nora was washing the massive stew pot, her hands red from the hot water. He watched her for a moment. Then he stood up and went to his workbench. He came back and held out his hand. In it was a spoon. It was made of pale, smooth birch, sanded until it felt like silk. The handle was long, thick, and perfectly balanced. The bowl of the spoon was deep. It was a tool, made by a man who understood work. It was strong. It was beautiful. Nora dried her hands and took it. It felt perfect, an extension of her own arm. She looked up at him, her eyes shining. "Jack," she whispered. "A cook needs proper tools," he said, his voice a low rumble. He touched the handle, his rough finger tracing the grain of the wood. I carved it to remind me I am not running anymore. I am staying right here. The sun was setting, bleeding orange and deep purple into the high clouds. The day's work at the eatery was done. The last customer, a surveyor, had ridden off. Jack sat on the top step of the wide porch, his back resting against the post. Nora sat on the step just below him, leaning back against his legs. It was a simple, quiet contact, a shared warmth. Ayanna was on the bottom step, sitting cross-legged, closest to the earth. The fading light caught the blue-black sheen of her hair as she worked, meticulously sharpening a handful of new arrowheads. The world was quiet. There was the whisper of the new spring wind in the pines. There was the soft, rhythmic shing, shing, shing of Ayanna's whetstone on the flint. And from the kitchen, the soft clink of Nora's new wooden spoon as she idly stirred the pot of stew simmering on the back of the stove. Keeping it warm, the sound was a steady, quiet beat. It was the pulse of the house. Jack looked out over the valley. The air was clean. He felt a peace so total it was almost a physical weight. He looked down at the top of Nora's head. He could smell the scent of wood smoke and rosemary that always clung to her. He had sworn an oath. On a frozen grave, he had sworn to stay cold. He had sworn off every pretty woman. He thought, I was a fool. She is not just pretty. She is more than that. She is a reason. She is the reason I am standing in the sun. Nora felt his gaze and tilted her head back, looking up at him. You are quiet, she said, her voice soft. What are you thinking about? I was just thinking, he said. I am not very good at making promises. Nora smiled, a slow, warm smile. She reached up with her free hand and laid it on his knee. Good, she said. Neither am I. I am not good at swearing big, loud oaths. She looked at the spoon in her other hand, then back at him. Her eyes were clear. I am just a cook, she said. I do not know how to swear forever. I just know how to cook for you until we are both old. Jack's hand came down, covering hers, his fingers, scarred and strong, laced with hers. He did not say anything. He did not need to. Ayanna did not look up from her work. She spoke, her voice quiet, in the language of her people. Nora looked at her, curious. Ayanna finished her sharpening. She looked at the arrowhead, testing its edge. Then she looked at them, her gaze clear and knowing. She translated. I said, when a house has a hearth, a warrior has a place to return. Jack met her eyes across the small space. He nodded. Yes, he said, his voice thick. We do. The next morning, the ground was warm. Jack had already cleared a large patch of earth behind the kitchen, fencing it against the deer. Ayanna returned from a visit to her people. She was not carrying game. She was carrying a heavy burlap sack. Seed, she said. It is time. She dropped the sack. Inside were potatoes and the small purple bulbs of wild onions. They worked together, the three of them. Jack, with his brute strength, turned the heavy, dark soil with a pitchfork. Ayanna, with her connection to the land, walked the rows, showing them where to plant, how to read the sun. Nora, with her cook's hands, knelt in the dirt, pressing the seed potatoes and the onion bulbs into the earth. They were a strange sight. The mountain man, the crow warrior, and the young cook, their hands were caked with mud. They worked, their movements easy and rhythmic, a family formed not by blood, but by fire, and storms, and shared food. They were planting a garden. They were planting their future. That evening, a traveler on a tired horse rode up the path. He was a stranger, just a man passing through. He saw the new house, the stable, the light in the windows. He saw the smoke rising from the chimney. The last of the evening sun, golden and kind, fell across the carved wooden sign, Grey Butte Eatery, and above it, the words that hung over the door like a blessing. Meals are promises. The traveler dismounted. He smelled the stew. He saw the warm light. The house was alive. It was a promise of a warm meal, of safety, a promise of a new and gentle future, high in the mountains. Thank you for listening to this story. Let me know in the comments where you are listening from. I would love to hear your thoughts. Please subscribe to Wild West Tales. Like this video, and give it a boost by hitting that hype button so this story can be heard by more people.